So today we're going to be breaking down an ambient and layered piano melody inside of FL Studio. So this melody has what I would consider 4 major layers to it. So there's the base of the melody, accents and top lines, the bass line, and then ear candy and other kind of textures. So starting off with the base of the melody, we have 3 sounds that I layered together from Keyscape. So starting off, I have the double grand felt, then the classic phaser Rhodes, and then finally the vibra-harp indie sign. So here's what those sound like when they're all combined together. So starting off with the MIDI for the classic phaser Rhodes piano is where we can see the basic chords that the melody is built around. So if I were to go ahead and build these chords again, I would start off with the root note of D sharp, then I would just build a basic 7th chord from there. Then I would go ahead and pitch up the F sharp and the C, double up the A sharp, and then add in this F to make it sound a little bit eerie. And we'll go back and revisit that chord later, but then looking back at the normal MIDI, you can see that that chord appears right here, and really there's no other variation in the melody. I only took out the second top 2 notes as variation, so it does switch up a little bit, but it's not enough to distract you and pull you away from the melody. I wanted to keep this super simple, so I only used 2 chords, and the second chord I just got by taking the main chord and putting it up 5, and as you can see, now the first and the third chord match. Moving on to the MIDI for the double felt piano is where things get a lot more complex. So as you can see here, I took those chords and I absolutely arpeggiated them and just messed them up beyond belief. So it sounds really cool and looks very complex, but really it's very easy to do if you have the time to just keep listening to something over and over again and getting a progression that sounds really interesting. So like I mentioned, let's revisit that first chord, but this time focus on the arpeggiation process. So for this example, I pitched that C sharp up just for a little bit of a different sound, but really I like to start with the bottom of the chord and work my way up. So I'll start off by moving the A sharp, then the F, and then the F sharp. So that sounds really cool, but it ends after that F sharp hit. So what I like to do is just keep replaying it and adding notes till I get a seamless progression that sounds really interesting. So I like the way that's sounding right here, but I'm going to make sure nothing is overlapping so it does sound right. And then what you can do is just copy this over and then just repeat it immediately after, and then it'll sound like it goes into each other and it's kind of an endless loop. And then what I like to do for the second part is just kind of move some of the notes around so it's a little bit more interesting and it doesn't get too static and boring. So then hopping back to the actual MIDI, you can see that I did that exact same process by working my bottom up and just going through the chord and arpeggiating something that sounds interesting. Of course with this, I did get a little bit more complex and add things like top lines and bass lines just to kind of fill it out and make it sound really cool. In the end, I did double time this melody and end up putting halftime, but here's what it would have sounded like if it was just left as is. Moving on to the last part of the base of the melody is the vibra-harp MIDI, and really this one is the most simple out of all of them, and it just copies the bass notes, and then I went ahead and copied some top line notes from the more crazy piano pattern. Really, this just kind of sits in the high end and gives it a little bit of texture, because I added some effects that kind of made it sound a little distorted and a little bit messed up, like tape effects and things like that. So before we move on to the effects, I did mention before that I double timed that piano, so how I did that was by rendering it out, and then I just moved this mob to 50% to shrink it to half the length, which speeds it up and pitches it up. After speeding it up, I went ahead and threw on Portal on on the drip on by preset, then halftime on the half preset, fruity flangus with the mix turned down to 40%, a EQ just to cut out all the lows, a compressor on the vintage preset, and then finally an imager with the width turned down. Moving on to the effects for the Rhodes piano, I started off with Fruity Reverb 2 with the decay and the wet knob turned up, then Fruity Chorus on the default preset, next was Valhalla Frequency Echo on the default preset, then another EQ to cut the lows, and then finally an imager to make it feel really nice and wide. Finally, for the Vibra Harp, I started off on Valhalla Supermassive on the Skinny 8th preset, then Portal on the cassette tape preset, then Grossbeat on the Tremolo Fast preset, which is automated, and then finally an EQ to boost the highs. Moving on to the accent and top line layer of the melody, I really only used one shots for this, so I started off by grabbing this whistle one shot, then a lead one shot, and finally this blue bells one shot. So here's what those sound like once they're all combined. Starting off with the MIDI for the whistle one shot, I just grabbed the root notes of the melody and then had them slide into a D note. How you get the slide notes is either by pressing S on your keyboard and then placing a note. As you can see, this little triangle indicates that it's a slide note. Alternatively, you can double click on any note and switch it to a slide note here. Slide notes are one of my favorite things to do with one shots, and it just gives a super unique sound that you sometimes can't really get with a VST depending on what the one shot is. Moving on to the lead MIDI, again, it is super simple. Really, I just again copied the bass notes and then had them slide into each other for the last notes. The only change I made with these slide notes is just lowering the velocity about halfway so it's a little bit quieter, because I felt that the slides in this one were a little bit overbearing, but they still did sound cool, so I wanted to kind of tuck them into the background. Finally, for the MIDI for the blues bell, again, it is super simple and there's really only two notes too. So these are the only two notes that are at max velocity, so they're really the ones that you hear, and I just kind of clicked these in by ear when I was making the melody. Then the second part of the MIDI is the little downward arpeggiating section, and I just kind of copied notes for the original MIDI until I got four that really worked well together and gave off kind of a dark and eerie sound. Moving on to the effects for all those sounds, starting off with the whistle one shot, all I added was a Fruity Reverb 2 with the pre-delay, decay, and the wet knob turned up. Moving on to the lead sound, I started off by adding Fruity Delay 3 on the mono preset, but I did go ahead and turn the time up. Then Fruity Fast Distort with the mix level at 15%, and finally an EQ just to cut out the lows. And then for the last sound, which is the blues bell, I actually didn't end up putting any effects on it because I thought it sounded alright as it was. Moving on to the third layer of the melody, which is the bass line, I started off by going into Omnisphere and grabbing this bass set solid sub preset, and then I layered that with a boo bass, which comes stock with FL Studio. So here's what those sound like once they're combined together. So then hopping into the MIDI for the Omnisphere bass, it's a bass pattern, so it's pretty simple and it just copies the root notes of the melody. The only things that I did to really spice it up were adding some pauses here and then also adding high notes that it kind of sweeps into. Then for the boo bass MIDI, it just does a double hit in the gaps from the other pattern. So as I mentioned before, I left a pause here in the Omnisphere bass, so I added in the boo bass to fill it up and kind of make them switch back and forth, which I've really been liking doing. Finally, for the effects on those, on the Omnisphere bass, all I have on it is a Fruity Fast Distort with the mix turned to 75%. Moving on to the boo bass, I have an EQ just to boost the mids, and then I have another EQ that is automated to kind of give it a telephone effect. So then finally moving on to the last layer of the melody, which is the textures, really there's not much explaining to do for any of them. It's really like all those videos that you see that what being a producer do you think is like, and then what it really is like, where they're just hitting the down key and listening to snares. That's pretty much the process for adding textures. I just go through all of the kits that I've collected over the years and just kind of add things that I think match the melody that I've already created. So here's what those all end up sounding like. Then finally, the last thing I did with the melody is take everything and render it all together. So here's what it sounds like when all four layers are all combined. So that's going to be pretty much it for the video. Thank you guys for watching. This, again, kind of fell into the trap of not making things for like 3 or 4 months. So this is the first one that I made that I was like, okay, I can make a video on this. It sounds pretty cool. I do have 2 other videos that are completely done, have short form and everything. So I have one about building my computer, pretty cool. And then I also have one about building my desk. So those will probably come out in the near future. I just kind of feel weird like coming back after a couple months and then posting a video about building something and not about music. So this one's probably going to be first. But yeah, thank you guys for watching. Hopefully more videos to come. Well, at least 2 more because I have those done. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Bye.